The year 1998 felt in many ways like a hopeful one. The charts were full of sweeping, emotional music. Titanic had just won 11 Academy Awards, and people were caught up in a story about love and tragedy on a grand cinematic scale. Somewhere in that same cultural moment, in the town of Oldham in Greater Manchester, a 20-year-old woman named Janine Waterworth was trying to quietly rebuild her life after walking away from a relationship that had slowly been breaking her down. Janine was well known around Oldham, not for anything dramatic, but for the things people genuinely remember about someone. A warm smile, a laugh that pulled other people into it. She was the kind of person who made a room feel slightly better just by being in it. Those who knew her described her that way without hesitation, the way people do when they are not searching for the right thing to say, but simply telling the truth. In the weeks before March of 1998, she had ended her relationship with 28-year-old Paul O'Hara and moved back into her parents' home in Higher Crompton. The decision had not been easy, but it had been the right one. Janine and Paul had been sharing a cramped two-bedroom flat on Tennyson Street with one of his relatives, and what she had hoped would become a stable life together had instead revealed itself to be something far more frightening. Her parents, Vera and Ian, had never been comfortable with Paul from the start. They could not quite explain why at first. He had been polite enough when he stayed at their home on occasion, but there was something that sat uneasily with them, a quality they could sense but not name. They had warned their daughter early on, and although Janine had listened, she had also believed something they could not yet see. She believed Paul was fundamentally good underneath it all. She believed she could help him. Paul O'Hara had a history that Janine's family knew nothing about. He had been in and out of trouble with the law for years, beginning with offenses like shoplifting and burglary, the kinds of things that might be written off as a troubled young man finding his footing. But by his 20s, the nature of his crimes had shifted into something much darker. He had beaten a man with a baseball bat. He had assaulted police officers. He had grievously wounded a man walking home from work simply because he wanted the jacket the man was wearing. He had broken a woman's arm and knocked another woman unconscious during a dispute. These were not impulsive moments separated by long stretches of ordinary life. They were a pattern persistent and escalating. Inside the relationship, Janine encountered the version of Paul that his criminal record had already drawn in ink. He drank almost every day. He used drugs regularly, which only amplified the jealousy and paranoia that were already present in him without any chemical assistance. He demanded to know where she was at every hour. When she came home from work, he interrogated her about who she had spoken to, who had looked at her, what she had said, and to whom. The violence came not long after. Those closest to Janine noticed that the woman they knew was disappearing, piece by piece. The smile came less easily. She seemed permanently tense, as though bracing for something. She was living each day on a wire, carefully measuring every word and movement, always trying to predict which version of Paul she was about to encounter. There is something specific and exhausting about that kind of fear. It is not the sharp fear of a single moment. It is the low, constant weight of never feeling safe in your own home. Anyone who has lived that way, or loves someone who has, understands what it does over time. It hollows a person. By March 1998, Janine had finally reached the end of what she could carry. She told Paul she needed space. She was moving back in with her parents to clear her head and get herself together. His response was predictable in the way that responses from men like Paul O'Hara almost always are at that point. He pleaded. He became the gentler version of himself, the one she had first been drawn to, the one she had always believed was the real him underneath everything else. He swore he could change. He begged her not to go. She went anyway, but Paul did not accept it. He began turning up at her parents' doorstep at all hours, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, fueled by whatever combination of alcohol and drugs had kept him awake through the night. He was fixated on the idea that she had found someone else. His behavior became erratic and relentless. Eventually, Janine made her position final. She told him it was completely over. She meant it, and he knew she meant it. 3 days later, on the morning of March 27th, 1998, Janine left her parents' house just before 6:30 in the morning to walk to the nearby bus stop on Trent Road. It was her usual route on workdays. She had walked it many times. It was the kind of short, familiar journey that feels so unremarkable that you never think twice about it. Paul O'Hara knew her routine. He had been hiding in an alleyway close to the bus stop, waiting for her, a carving knife in his hand. As Janine neared the bus stop, he emerged and dragged her into the alleyway where he stabbed her 12 times with a force so savage that the blade of the knife snapped off inside her body. Janine screamed for help throughout the attack. Neighbors heard her, several of them. And yet no one came out until it was over. Paul fled the scene, leaving her bleeding on the ground. She died there, less than 400 yards from her parents' front door. Within hours, Paul O'Hara was found wandering drunkenly through Oldham city center and placed under arrest. He admitted to stabbing Janine during questioning. In November of 1998, at Manchester Crown Court, he was found guilty of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. He reportedly collapsed in the dock as the verdict was delivered. In prison, Paul was assessed repeatedly by criminal psychologists. The results consistently indicated high levels of psychopathy. He made a phone call to Janine's parents at some point, framing it as an apology. Her father, Ian, answered, initially thinking it was someone else. When he realized who was on the line, he told Paul simply that sorry meant nothing now. He was right. The call carried no weight and no truth. Paul showed no genuine remorse during his years of incarceration. He was accustomed to dominating people he considered weaker, but prison had placed him in an environment where his usual methods carried little currency. In April of 2012, as the country was preparing for the London Olympics, generating the kind of national excitement that makes everything else feel temporary and distant, Paul O'Hara was released early from prison on license. He had served less than 14 years of his life sentence. The conditions of his license required him to maintain regular contact with a supervising officer, live at an approved address, abstain from drugs and alcohol, and find full-time employment. These were the standard terms. They were also terms that Paul O'Hara, with his entire documented history, was never realistically going to honor. Multiple prison psychologists had raised concerns before his release, noting that he still posed a significant risk to vulnerable women. Those concerns were not enough to keep him inside. There is a question worth sitting with here. When every piece of available evidence about a person points in one direction, how does a decision get made that points in the other? Some believe the answer lies in the systemic pressure at the time to reduce prison numbers, a pressure that may have influenced decisions that should have been made purely on the basis of risk. Others hold that the parole process simply failed to weigh the full gravity of what Paul O'Hara was. Both things can be true simultaneously, and perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all. 40-year-old Shirley Shannon, known as Sherry to the people she loved, was someone who moved through life with energy and warmth. She had originally run a beauty salon called Sheer Bliss in Waterford, Lancashire, where she was the kind of person customers sought out not just for a haircut, but because talking to her made them feel better. She baked cheesecakes for her clients. She walked her 5 Akita dogs around Waterford and was a familiar, cheerful presence in the neighborhood. Her family described her as someone who was always laughing, always finding the light in things. When the salon closed, she did not let it define her. She went back to college in 2009 to study forensic science and began working as a carer for people in assisted living. She opened a secondhand furniture shop in Haywood, Greater Manchester, with her partner Graham, the father of her 11-year-old daughter. The business was growing. Life, in many of its most important ways, was full. Graham and Sherry remained deeply close and co-parented well, even as they had begun living separately as romantic partners. As she turned 40, she was looking for something new in that part of her life. She wanted someone to share it with. In July of 2013, Paul O'Hara applied for a job at the furniture shop. He got it, and it did not take long for him to present himself as someone entirely different from what he was. Sherry told friends that he seemed like a big, cuddly teddy bear. Teddy made her smile. The relationship moved forward. There is a particular cruelty in watching this happen in hindsight, knowing what was coming and knowing that Sherry had no reason to suspect it. She had not been told about Paul's history. The people responsible for monitoring him had spoken with her on the phone at some point to ask whether he had disclosed his past. She said yes. But what the full picture later revealed was that Paul had been standing behind her at knife point during that conversation, dictating her answers. She was not confirming his disclosure. She was performing it under duress, with a blade at her back and a man watching her face to make sure she did not slip. She had no idea who she was really with. By bonfire night, November 5th, 2013, the violence was already well underway. Sherry arrived at the family's annual gathering with her jaw fractured and her nose broken, bruising across her face so visible that everyone in the room was immediately alarmed. She told them she had fallen down the stairs drunk in high heels. Nobody could prove otherwise in that moment, and she was clearly not going to say more. The family suspected the truth, but could not reach through the wall she had placed between herself and them. Paul had punched her hard enough on one occasion to knock her unconscious. When she came to over an hour later, he was asleep on the sofa. He told her he thought she was dead and had not known what to do. The violence escalated from there. Her cheekbone was smashed during a confrontation over custody of her daughter with Graham. She had been headbutted, kicked in the stomach, held at knife point for hours. He monitored her constantly, demanding to know where she was and who she was speaking to, hinted an explosive over her ongoing co-parenting relationship with Graham. This is the part of domestic abuse that is hardest to communicate to someone who has never experienced it from the inside. It is not simply a matter of leaving. By the time it reaches that point, leaving is the most dangerous thing a person can do, and every woman who has lived inside that situation understands exactly what that sentence means. Sherry knew. She was trying. During a 5-hour phone call with her sister Ellen, Sherry finally broke down and told her everything. Ellen told Graham. The family urged Sherry to go to the authorities. She did. She contacted Paul's parole officer directly, knowing that under the terms of his license, the domestic violence she was reporting should have been enough to have him recalled to prison immediately. It should have been straightforward. It was not. When officers visited her at home, they treated her account as a historic incident rather than an active and ongoing threat. Despite her visible injuries and her obvious fear, no action was taken to apprehend Paul O'Hara. What followed made everything worse. Paul was informed that she had made complaints against him. He was advised to give her space. Instead of staying away, he beat her and then coached her, word by word, with him hiding in a cupboard and watching her through a crack in the door to make sure she followed his instructions. When officers returned 2 days later for a follow-up visit, she stood in that room and told them she had made everything up. She delivered his script flawlessly because the alternative was not something she was willing to risk. The moment that finally pushed her to act came when Paul made threatening remarks against her daughter. The child she had built her entire life around. That was the line he had crossed that Sherry could not step back from. When he left the house, she called the police immediately and told them everything. She pleaded with them to come and arrest him for violating the terms of his parole. She was afraid and she was urgent and she was clear. Just over an hour later, 2 domestic violence officers arrived at the address. Paul O'Hara had been watching from his car down the street. He armed himself with a hammer, ran around to the back of the house, and let himself in through the back door. He struck Detective Sergeant Damian Mallister repeatedly over the head with the hammer, knocking him unconscious. He then turned on Detective Constable Karen Kenworthy, threatening her with a carving knife he had taken from the kitchen. Sherry ran from the house screaming, and he chased her into the street where he stabbed her repeatedly in front of multiple witnesses who stood helplessly on the pavement watching her fall. Backup officers arrived and subdued him, but Shirley Shannon was pronounced dead at the scene. The paramedics worked quickly to remove her body before her daughter arrived home from school. In June 2014, Paul O'Hara was sentenced at Preston Crown Court to a whole life order, meaning no possibility of parole. He will die in prison. It was the only sentence that made any sense given what he had done twice and the pattern that preceded it, documented in full across decades. But for the people who loved Sherry and Janine, the sentence was not the thing that occupied their minds most. It was everything that had happened before it. Sherry's family was direct and precise about this in the aftermath. The knowledge that Paul had been on a life license, that the bar for recalling him to prison was deliberately low, that the abuse had been reported, that the injuries were visible, that the fear was evident, and that nothing was done, that knowledge did not fade with the verdict. It settled into a place that does not move. Sherry's mother, Betty, described her daughter as their rock. Beautiful, caring, kind. Taken from them by a man with a fully documented history of violence against women, released on a license that was supposed to come with strict oversight, killed while that oversight stood aside. Her sister Siobhan put it plainly, knowledge is power. The people who were supposed to protect Sherry had both the knowledge and the power. They had every piece of information required to act, and Sherry paid for the gap between what should have happened and what actually did. There is a pattern in this case that is worth naming clearly because it does not begin with Paul O'Hara, and it did not end with him. The pattern is this. Abuse rarely announces itself in its most extreme form first. It builds. It starts with jealousy framed as love, with monitoring framed as care, with control framed as protection. By the time the violence is undeniable, the person experiencing it has often already been isolated from the people who could help. And the systems meant to respond are frequently looking at each incident in isolation rather than reading the full picture of what has been accumulating. Both Janine Waterworth and Shirley Shannon encountered a version of the same man operating from the same playbook, charming at first, escalating steadily, using every tool available, affection, guilt, fear, physical force to keep the woman he was with from leaving, and then punishing her catastrophically when she did. The fact that this happened twice with 14 years of a life sentence between the two killings, and with a system that was specifically designed to prevent exactly this outcome, is the part that is most difficult to absorb. In the years that followed Sherry's murder, Janine's father Ian reached out to Sherry's family. Two families brought together by the same man, separated by 15 years and the failure of a system that had the second chance to stop him and did not take it. The whole life order Paul O'Hara received means that, in a practical sense, the story is resolved. He will not be released. He will not have the opportunity to do this again. But the resolution of a legal case and the resolution of the questions it raises are not the same thing. The legal outcome is settled. The questions are not. What is the appropriate weight to give a warning that comes from a woman who is frightened? How many times does a pattern need to repeat before it is treated as a pattern and not as a series of separate incidents? And when a system has the tools to intervene and all the information it needs, what is the cost of choosing not to use them? Those are not questions with clean answers, but they are the questions that Sherry's family, Janine's family, and anyone paying attention to this case are left holding long after the courtroom doors have closed. Janine Waterworth was 20 years old. She was walking to a bus stop on a morning in March. She had a lovely smile and a laugh that pulled people in. She had just started to rebuild. Shirley Shannon was 40 years old. She had 5 dogs and a daughter and a shop that was growing and a laugh that her family still describes with a kind of precision that only comes from genuinely missing someone. She had just found the courage to call for help. Both of them deserved better than what the world gave them at the end.